Here's what I want to say to you tonight, Bethel. Jehoshaphat faced an impossible situation. He had the history and the testimonies of how God had moved in his past. He had the history and the testimonies of how God had moved in the past for Israel. But now he faced an impossible situation. In the midst of it, the prophetic voice comes. And the prophetic voice, prophecy isn't something you can often see with your eyes. It's something you have to believe with your heart. And how it's much easier to prophesy something than it is to actually see it. And to have faith simply because it's been prophesied is to believe that it's the word of the Lord and to trust God above what you can see with your eyes. And here's what happened is Israel comes in the place of discouragement, so discouraged that all of Israel gathers, so overwhelmed, so feeling, how are we going to fight this battle? How will we overcome? And in the midst of it, something begins to happen. You know what that thing that began to happen was? Hope. Hope. The voice of the prophet. The character and the nature of God revealed to the people of God. The promise of God. The prophecy of God. And the next thing you know, hope begins to well up in their hearts. And when hope becomes larger than crisis, then volunteerism arises. You see, we look at periods of our history. Think about Hudson Taylor when he went to China. It was nothing but crisis. There was no hope. How could this vast nation be reached with the gospel with so little gospel presence until something happened? You know what happened? Hope. Hudson Taylor went. The Chinese began to turn to Jesus. He went back to his native nation and began to talk to them and say that though it seems impossible, though the army seems massive, though it seems all odds are against us, I want to tell you, God is prevailing. And at some point, that hope grew larger than that crisis. And the moment that it tips the scales, volunteerism arose. And by the hundreds, they signed up to lay their lives down in China. We look at the history of our nation. Think about something as significant as World War II. And my dad, and I love hearing the stories of, my dad was in the Vietnam War, and my grandparents were all in World War II, and the stories were passed down. And they would say to me, they say, Andy, when the war began, it seemed totally hopeless. It seemed that this evil would take over the whole earth. Nobody could stop what was happening. Nation after nation was falling. But something happened in America. Do you know what it was? Was hope. And all of a sudden, a whole generation of young men and young women believed that something that was totally impossible in the physical was actually possible. And hope began to rise in their hearts. You know what happened when hope overcame the crisis? They laid their lives down in volunteerism because their hope was now bigger than the crisis. And by the thousands and thousands, they went off believing that they could hand the next generation a greater nation than they had been handed. And could it be right now, Bethel, like Jehoshaphat, we might look out at our nation and go, my gosh, there are some difficulties going on. There are some tensions. There is some division. There is some oppression. There is some brokenness. There's a lot of it. There are natural disasters and there are caused disasters. You can look out at the nations and go, my gosh, there is upheaval in nations of the earth. And there are certain places right now that you just go, my goodness, it is so hard. And it's real. But you know what's happening in the midst of it? Hope. Hope. The word of the Lord is landing in our hearts. And Bethel, you are a beacon of hope when no one else believed. I felt like for years I would pray for the sick and they'd get sicker. And then Bethel. Worship was boring. And then Bethel. Then it was like you really want to see a breakthrough and healing of the power of God. You went to India. And then Bethel. Many would look out at the nation and they would read the headlines and get angry at the lost for being lost. Not Bethel. And some would look at the difficulties surrounding our cities, our nation, and go, my gosh, is there any way through? Not Bethel. You're a beacon of hope. You're a message of hope. And the hour we're heading into, are you ready for this, Bethel? The hour we're heading into is the hope is about to grow larger than the crisis. And when the hope gets bigger than the crisis in this nation, do you know what will happen? Volunteerism like we have never seen in the history of our nation. And a generation will freely volunteer for the hardest and darkest places in the cities and in our communities and in our neighborhoods and in our high schools and in our universities and in the nations of the earth, because hope grew bigger than the crisis. We are on the verge of the greatest volunteer movement in all of human history. And I want to say, Bethel, you're leading us there. You're leading us there.